This is the Weekend Report. I'm Masachaba Mposwa. Stellenbosch University, in collaboration with the Research on Socio-economic Policy and Teacher Demographics, released the Teacher Preferences and Job Satisfaction in South Africa report last year. The report examines how teachers' working conditions across schools affect their mental and financial well-being. A key finding is that 50% of surveyed and interviewed teachers express a desire to leave the profession within the next 10 years, primarily due to excessive workloads and administrative burdens. Let's get more insights on this report now with senior researcher at the Socio-economic Policy, Dr. Heleen Hofmeyr. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Good morning.
Hi, Mr. Chava. Thank you for having me.
Firstly, Doctor, thank you for joining us. What inspired this research and what gaps in knowledge did you aim to address?
Right. So at RECEP, we undertook a broader study called the Teacher Demographic Dividend, which was all about trying to understand how upcoming teacher retirements would affect the workforce. And as we were looking at the data, we actually saw that, yes, we've got a lot of teachers who are going to retire, but we also actually see teachers who are leaving the profession before retirement. And we had engagement with provincial education departments to show them our retirement findings. And they also confirmed, look, thank you for this information, but another problem we face is that teachers are actually leaving the profession before they retire for other reasons. And so we came up with the idea that maybe it would be important to really ask the question, what is driving teachers out of the profession, and what can we potentially do to address this?
What are the most surprising findings from the Teacher Preferences and Job Satisfaction in South Africa report?
So, it's like you say in the title, we really wanted to understand teacher job satisfaction and preferences. But as we did our survey and did these follow-up interviews with teachers, it became very clear that teachers are having major mental health struggles, and this was not something that we set out to investigate, but it just kind of came up during the study. And for me, perhaps the most surprising and disheartening finding really was just this immense emotional strain that teachers suffer from because they are kind of dealing with major social issues in the classroom. Children are navigating extremely difficult circumstances at home. I think it's clear that children are exposed to traumatic events. 6 out of 10 children in South Africa will experience a traumatic event before the age of 17. And teachers often being kind of frontline, first responders, in a sense, to this situation. Sometimes a teacher is the most stable, supportive adult in a child's life. And this means that de facto, they become social workers, they become psychologists. And this really was a very striking finding of our study.
This makes perfect sense because it is said that the classroom is just a microcosm of society, right? So how do you think that the excessive administrative burden on teachers can be reduced?
Right. So I think one of the things that came out about all of the admin that teachers had to do was this perception that a lot of it was just a kind of box-ticking exercise, that a lot of the forms and the reports that they were being asked to submit by their districts were never really being looked at. An example was there's this policy that teachers have to submit a progress report on every learner in their class. And we have to remember that it's not uncommon for a teacher to have 50, even 60 learners in their class. And the idea behind the policy is we need to identify at the district level which learners are struggling so that we can send subject advisors into those schools to help those learners. But what was happening was that teachers were submitting these reports and then not getting that district support. So it was very much a feeling that the tasks were not being looked at, that was just a box-ticking exercise. So I think the very first thing that we can do to lessen the burden would be to review what are all these administrative tasks that we're asking teachers to do, which of them are non-essential, which of them are actually repetitive, and which can we actually cut from their workload.
I'd like to just expand on that a little bit more. You speak about which of them are which can we expand on? I'd like you to expand on that. Which can we expand on?
So unfortunately, we didn't ask particularly exactly which tasks teachers have to do. I think that would be a much too long list for them to tick off. But I think one of the opportunities here that teachers also mentioned as being very helpful is the National Teaching Assistant Program, where surveys from the teaching assistants also revealed that a lot of what they do in the classroom is take over some of the administrative tasks that teachers are asked to do. So I think, sometimes there are certain tasks that only a teacher can complete, but there are many tasks that TAs, teaching assistants, can actually help with. And so I think that's a promising avenue to start thinking about how can we use teaching assistants to lessen teachers' administrative burden.
And what specific mental health support systems would you recommend for teachers?
So I think ideally we would have a psychologist in every school, both for teachers and for learners. That would help teachers to deal with the struggles that they have, but also it would lessen that burden that teachers have of acting as informal psychologists to learners. So that really is the ideal, but of course that is going to take kind of major financial investments, and the department is very constrained financially, unfortunately. But I think an opportunity in this regard is the ongoing in-service teacher training that teachers are required to attend. We just saw that 40,000 teachers were trained in robotics and coding, which is absolutely fabulous. We should absolutely be investing in training teachers to teach these very important 21st century skills. But the training that is ongoing, that there is funding for, that is scheduled in the annual calendar, why not use that as an opportunity to provide workshops for teachers and to teach them how to deal with the stress and how to take care of their mental health.
All right. And in closing, before we let you go, what message would you like to convey to teachers, to policymakers and education authorities regarding teacher well-being?
I think to teachers, I would just say, we hear you. As a researcher, I am very aware that up until now, I have focused very much on how bad the outcomes are that we produce in our country. And often we blame teachers as the people producing those outcomes. And of course, they have a role to play. But I think what this report makes so clear is that education doesn't exist in a vacuum. Teachers are dealing, like you said, classrooms are a microcosm of society. And I hope that this report brings to the fore that important role that teachers is playing. To policymakers and the national department, I would just say, look at the efforts that are being undertaken by philanthropies. We see emerging efforts from NGOs that are working on supporting teachers and providing mental health assistance. Have conversations with these NGOs. Ask them, what are they doing? Is it working? And how could the department potentially support them in scaling up those efforts?
Thank you so much for your time, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.